I have buried most of the people I am about to tell you of, and I have outlived the house they built, but I have never once outlived the winter that made them. I was 8 years old the autumn my Uncle Gideon married a woman he did not love, and I was 9 the spring he would have walked into a blizzard barefoot for her. And the country between those two facts is the only country I have ever truly known. Folks who knew them late, who saw only the gray-headed pair on the porch of the Bell Iron with the whole benchland green below them, used to say they were the easiest married people in the county, like two boots off the same last. They never knew it began as a piece of paper, neither one meant to mean a thing. My uncle was a hard man that year, and I will not pretend otherwise to make him kinder than he was. His wife Ada had been 4 years dead by then, gone in a fever that took her in a single night and left him with a ranch and a stone where his heart used to sit. He did not cry that I ever saw. He did not speak her name. He ran the Bell Iron with a kind of grim, joyless competence, up before the light and down after it. And when my mother, his sister Mary, died of the same country and the same hardness 2 winters later, he came and got me and my little sister Tess off the dying claim our father had abandoned, and he did it without a word of comfort and without a word of complaint. He loaded us in the wagon, he covered Tess with his own coat, and he drove us up to the benchland and told us this was home now, and that was the whole of it. I loved him the way you love weather. There was no use arguing with him and no use expecting him to soften, and you took shelter where the shelter was. So you must understand that when Verena Ashcroft rode up our lane on a borrowed gray mare in the last week of September, with the cottonwoods along Quail Creek just starting to turn, she was riding into a house that had forgotten how to be warm. I was the first to see her. I was forking hay down from the loft, and I stopped with the fork in the air, because we did not get visitors, and we surely did not get women, and this one sat her saddle like she had grown there. She was not what the town would have called a beauty. She was lean and weathered and sun-marked at the eyes, with dark hair pinned up under a flat brown hat, and her dress had been turned and mended at the cuffs more than once. But she sat that borrowed mare like she owned the whole of the Sawtooth country, and when my uncle came out of the barn wiping his hands, she did not climb down and she did not look away. "You're Gideon Crane," she said. It was not a question. "I am. I'm Verena Ashcroft. I have the claim at Ash Hollow east of you under the rim. My husband had it. He's 2 years in the ground now." She said it plain, the way you'd report the weather. "I've come to put a business proposition to you, Mr. Crane, and I'd be obliged if you heard it through before you said no." I had never in my life heard a woman talk to my uncle like that, and I do not think he had either. He stood there a moment with the rag in his hands. Then he tipped his head toward the house. "Coffee's hot," he said, and that was the most courtesy I had seen from him in a year. I was not supposed to listen. I listened anyway. I came down from the loft and went around to the kitchen window with Tess, who was 6 and full of questions, and I put my hand over her mouth, and we crouched there in the cool September shade, and we heard the whole of it. Her proposition was this. She had a spring. Not a seep, not a wet-weather wash, but a living spring at the head of Ash Hollow that ran cold and clean the year around and had never once failed in the worst of the dry years, when half the wells in the county went to mud and the creeks went to bone. Her late husband, Tom Ashcroft, had filed on that hollow for the spring and nothing else, and he had borrowed against it from the bank at Merrow's Crossing to buy stock and seed and a plow, and then he had died of a horse's kick before he could make $1 of it pay. The note had come down to her. It was due in full at the new year, and she did not have it, and she would never have it, and Mr. Pell at the bank had already let her know in his soft, regretful way that come January the hollow and the spring with it would go on the block. "And here is the part that concerns you," she said. "The man most likely to buy it is Harlan Voss." I felt my uncle go still even through the wall. Harlan Voss ran the biggest outfit on the far side of the rim, the Double V, and he had been buying up water all over the county for 10 years, one failed claim at a time, the way a man fills his pockets with stones. He had no quarrel with my uncle that I knew of. He did not need one. If Voss had the Ash Hollow Spring, he would have the only sure water on the east side of the Sawtooth, and the Bell Iron sat down country of it. And in a dry year a man who owns the high water owns everybody under him, whether he means to or not. He'd run that water down to his own range and let yours go dry, Verena said. You know it and I know it. I am offering you the chance to see that it never happens. I'll deed you a half share in the spring and a right of way to bring the water across to your benchland. In exchange, you take up my note. You'll have the surest water in the county and a creditor of Voss's off your fence line forever. There was a long quiet. I heard my uncle set his cup down. That's a deal a man makes with a lawyer, he said. Why ride up here to make it with me? And here she did not flinch, and I have admired her for it every day of my life since. Because the bank won't lend a widow the money to save her own claim, she said, and won't sell a half-share to a woman without a man's name on the paper, and Voss has already made it known he'll outbid any honest buyer. A lone woman with a debt and no husband has exactly one card to play in this county, Mr. Crane, and I have come to play it with my eyes open. I am proposing a marriage. On paper. You take my name onto the note so the bank will deal, you pay it. The spring is saved and shared between us, and we go on living as we have lived, you in your house, me in mine, 2 ranches and 1 piece of water and no claim of any kind by either of us on the other. I keep my hollow. I keep myself. I am not asking you to love me, and I am not offering to love you. I am offering you water which lasts instead of love which in my experience does not. I was 8, and I did not understand the half of it, but I understood the iron in her voice, and I understood that she was a person who had been hurt and had decided to never be hurt again, and had built herself a fortress out of plain speech, and was standing inside it now daring my uncle to come at her. He did not come at her. That was the first thing that ever surprised me about that autumn. I've got 2 children in this house, he said. My sisters. The boy's 8, the girl's 6. They're not part of any bargain and they're not a chore I'm handing off. I want that understood. Then it's understood, she said. I'll not be their mother. I'll not pretend at it, but I won't be unkind to them either. I've never in my life been unkind to a child. All right, said my uncle. And that was all. That was the whole of it. I have heard men spend an hour deciding which horse to buy. My uncle Gideon Crane decided to marry a stranger in the time it takes the coffee to cool, because the logic of it was clean and the water was real and the rest of life had stopped meaning much to him, and a thing that made sense was easier to say yes to than a thing that asked him to feel. They were married 11 days later in the front room of the Marrows Crossing Church by a preacher named Eldridge who did not ask too many questions, and married too many strangers in that hard country to be surprised by any of them. Verena wore a clean dark dress and no veil and no flowers. My uncle wore his good coat, which was also his only coat, brushed for the occasion. There was no one there but the 2 of them, the preacher's wife as a witness, and me and Tess in the back pew because there was no one to leave us with. When the preacher said the part about love, Verena looked straight ahead and did not blink, and my uncle looked at the floor, and the 2 of them said the words the way you'd recite the multiplication table. And then it was done, and we drove home in the wagon in a silence so complete I could hear the harness leather creak. That night she did not come to the Bell Iron. She rode back to her own hollow under the rim, to her own bed and her own roof, exactly as the bargain said she would, and my uncle put us to bed and went out and stood a long time in the dark by the corral, and I watched him from the loft window, a black shape against the stars, not moving. And I did not know then that a man can be lonely in 2 directions at once, for the wife he lost, and for the wife he had just married and did not know how to want. So that is how it began. A note paid, a spring shared, a name on a paper, 2 houses, 2 ranches, 2 graves between them they each kept private, and a winter coming on that none of us could yet see the size of. I will tell you how it changed. It changed slow at first. The way ground thaws, you cannot watch it happen. You only notice one morning that it has. The arrangement called for them to work the water together, and water does not care about a person's pride. The right of way had to be dug, a ditch run from the head of Ash Hollow along the contour of the rim and down across the toe of our benchland, 2 miles of it, before the freeze locked the ground for good. My uncle could not dig 2 miles of ditch alone and run the bell iron besides, and he had no money to hire, and so Verena came. She came at first light with her own shovel and her own gloves and her own dinner pail, and she dug. I want you to hear that plainly, because the town never believed it. She dug ditch alongside my uncle from the gray of the morning to the gold of the evening, day after autumn day, and she dug as much in a day as he did. And she never once asked him to slow for her, and he never once offered. I worked the near end of it with them as much as a boy of 8 is any use, which is to say, I carried water and moved stones and got told to mind the children, meaning Tess, and mostly I watched. I watched 2 people who had agreed not to matter to each other slowly fail at it. It was the small things. It is always the small things. The first week they ate their dinners apart, she on her side of the cut, he on his, like 2 strangers on a train. The second week she found him favoring a hand he'd torn open on a buried root and pretending he hadn't. And without a word she came over and took his hand and looked at it and packed it with something out of a tin she carried, a salve of beeswax and herbs, for she kept bees at the hollow and made her own and bound it up in clean cloth, all business, and went back to her digging. He flexed the hand. He looked at it like it belonged to somebody else. He said, "Obliged." That was the second word of courtesy I had heard from him that year, and the woman had pulled it out of him with beeswax. By the third week they ate their dinners in the same place. Not together exactly. Near. He'd say a thing about the line of the ditch and she'd answer it and they'd argue the grade of it, because she had an eye for water that he didn't and she was right more often than he liked. And the arguing was the first thing between them that wasn't cold. You could not have called it warm, but you could not have called it nothing either, and I had grown up in a house of nothing and I knew the difference. The thing that did it, the thing that cracked the first real seam in my uncle, was Tess and the bees. Tess was 6 and afraid of nothing, which is a terrible quality in a small child on a working ranch, and one afternoon while we were all down at the ditch she wandered off, the way she did, and she found Verena's mare hobbled in the shade and decided to make friends with it, and the mare spooked at something and clipped her with a hoof not bad, a glancing thing across the shoulder, but it knocked her down, and she screamed the high thin scream of a child who has just learned the world can hurt her. My uncle got to her first. He had her up off the ground before the rest of us had turned around, and he was holding her against his chest, and his face had gone a color I had never seen on it, white under the brown, and his hands were shaking, and I understood all at once that my hard uncle was not hard at all, that he was a man who had buried a wife and a sister, and was waiting every single day for the country to take the last 2 children he had left, and that the hardness was just the lid he kept on the fear. He could not speak, he just stood there holding her, shaking. And it was Verena who stepped in. She came and put her hands over his hands the way you gentle a horse, and she said, "Lo, let me see her, Gideon, I doctor better than I dig." And he let her. He let this stranger take the child out of his arms, and she sat Tess down on the grass and felt the shoulder all over with those quick brown hands and said, "Nothing broke. She'll have a bruise the size of a plum and a story to tell for a week. Look at me, sweetheart, you're all right. You're all right." And Tess stopped screaming and started crying the ordinary way, which is the good way, and Verena held her and rocked her a little and hummed something with no tune to it. And over the top of Tess's head she looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked back at her, and something passed between them that I did not have words for then and barely have words for now. It was not love yet, but it was the place where love would put down roots. It was 2 people recognizing, in the same instant, that they were both terrified of the same thing, of loving anybody in a country that took people away in a single night, and that they had each spent years building a wall against it, and that the walls had just, both at once, sprung a leak. That night Verena did not ride back to the hollow. She stayed to sit up with Tess in case of fever, she said, though there was no fever and never would be, and she sat in the kitchen by the lamp with the child asleep in the next room, and my uncle sat across from her, and they did not say much, and I lay in the loft and listened to the long silences between the few words, and I thought, even at 8, even not knowing what I was thinking, something is happening to them. Something is happening that they did not put in the paper. She rode home in the morning. The bargain held, but she had stayed the night under his roof, and the wall had a hole in it the size of a frightened child, and you cannot fill that kind of hole back up. They had both learned that day that the other one could be trusted with the thing they were most afraid of, and there is no walking back from a thing like that. There is only walking forward slow, pretending you aren't. The ditch was finished the second week of October, and the water came down it. I will never forget the morning they opened the head gate. The whole of us stood at the toe of the benchland and watched the cold, clean water of Ash Hollow come walking down that ditch toward the Bell Iron, a low silver tongue of it feeling its way along the new cut, 2 miles from the spring, and when it reached the catch basin my uncle had dug and began to fill it, Verena let out a breath like she'd been holding it for 2 years, which I expect she had. My uncle crouched down and put his hand in the water and held it there. He didn't say anything. But he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and for just a second the two of them grinned at each other like a pair of children, 2 grown, grieving people grinning over a ditch full of water, and then they both remembered themselves and put their faces back on. I have thought, in the long years since, that I would trade a good deal to have that 1 second back, to stand again at the edge of that benchland and watch the two of them forget for a heartbeat to be afraid. Then the winter came. I have lived through a great many winters in this country, and I have never seen one to match it, and the old men who were old when I was young said the same, that there had not been a winter like it in their father's time. It came early, and it came hard. The first storm hit in the last days of October, a wet, heavy snow that broke limbs off the cottonwoods and lay a foot deep on the benchland and did not melt, and behind it came the cold, a still iron cold that cracked the trees at night and froze the catch basin 3 inches down by morning, and behind the cold came more snow, storm on storm on storm, all the long black middle of that year, until the fences were buried and the cattle stood humped and frosted in the lee of the rim, and a man could lose the trail between the house and the barn in the time it took to walk it. Verena could not winter alone at the hollow. There was no arguing it, though she tried, because she was a woman who had never in her life leaned on another soul, and the prospect of it frightened her worse than the cold did. But the snow shut the trail between our 2 places by the middle of November, and her woodpile was a third of what it needed to be, and a person cannot keep a fire and tend stock and break ice and haul feed alone through a winter like that one. It kills the strongest man alive who tries it, and she knew it. And so on the day the second big storm was building gray and low over the Sawtooth, she rode the gray mare down to the Bell Iron with what she could carry and her hives wrapped in burlap against the cold, and she said to my uncle, stiff with the shame of needing anything, "I'd take it as a loan of shelter. Till the thaw. I'll work my keep and I'll sleep in the lean-off the kitchen and the paper stands as the paper says." And my uncle, who by then had learned a thing or two about the size of her pride, did not make it harder than it was. He said, "There's a room. Caleb can move in with Tess. You'll have your own door." He did not say "I'm glad." He did not say "stay." But he had her room ready before the storm hit, and he'd built a bracket by the kitchen stove for her hives so the bees would not freeze, and a man does not build a bracket for a woman's bees if she is only a piece of paper to him, and I think she saw the bracket and understood it for what it was, which was the most my uncle could say out loud at that point in his life, which was, "You are welcome here. You and the small living things you care for. Welcome." So we wintered together, the 4 of us and the bees, in the Bell Iron house under the rim, while the storms came down off the Sawtooth one after another like they meant to bury the country for good. And it was in that long shut-in winter that the 2 of them, having no place to hide from one another, stopped being able to pretend. You learn a person in a winter like that. You cannot help it. You learn how they take their coffee and how they sit and what they say in their sleep through a thin wall and how they are with a child at the end of a bad day. My uncle learned that Verena, behind the iron, was funny, dry as a creek bed in August, but funny, and that she sang under her breath when she thought no one heard old sad songs from somewhere east, and that she could not abide a thing left half done and could not stop herself from finishing it, and that she had a fierce gentleness in her that she had spent her whole life apologizing for by being sharp. And Verena learned that my uncle behind the stone was kind, clumsy at it out of practice, but kind down to the floor of him, and that he sat up half the nights of that winter whittling, by lamplight, a whole little ark of animals for Tess, horse and cow and dog and a tiny bear, never saying a word about it, just setting one more on the windowsill every few days for her to find, and that he had never once gotten over Ada and did not know that a man could love twice and was secretly, quietly, terrified to find out he could. I watched it happen. I had the best seat in the house, being a boy that nobody troubled to send out of a room, and I watched my uncle and his paper wife fall in love over the course of that winter, the way the ditch had filled, slow and silent, and from the bottom up, until one day you looked and it was full. There was the night of the milk cow. She went down in the deep of January, the good brown cow that gave us what little fresh we had, went down sick and bloated in the barn in the worst cold of the whole winter, and she would have died. And a milk cow in January is the difference between a hard winter and a starving one. My uncle did what he knew, which was not enough, and Verena did what she knew, which was a great deal, for she had doctored stock her whole life, and the two of them worked over that cow half the night by lantern light in a barn so cold their breath froze on their collars, passing the work back and forth between them without hardly a word now, the way two hands of the same body work. And along about 3 in the morning the cow heaved and rose and lived, and the two of them sat down right there in the dirty straw. Exhausted, leaning back against the stall, shoulder to shoulder, too tired to remember to keep apart, and they laughed, the both of them, low and helpless and worn through, and then they were quiet, and my uncle said into the cold dark of the barn, the first true thing I ever heard him say to her. I didn't think I'd ever be glad of anything again. And Verena said after a while, neither did I. That was all. Two people too proud and too scared to say the whole of it. But I was up in the loft of the barn where I had no business being, having sneaked out to see about the cow, and I heard it and I knew. They were not strangers anymore. They were not even a bargain anymore. They were two people who had been glad, at 3 in the morning in a freezing barn, only because the other one was there. There is a word for that, and they both knew the word, and neither one of them was ready to say it, and the winter was only half over. The winter was only half over, and it had not yet done its worst, and its worst is the part I have never told to anybody, not in 70 years, and will tell you now because there is no one left it can hurt. It was the 3rd week of February, in the dead bottom of the cold, when the great storm came, the one they named in the county afterward, the one the old-timers measured all later storms against. It came up out of the northwest in the afternoon with no more warning than a green-black line low on the sawtooth and a smell in the air like cold iron, and by dark it was on us in full, a wind that drove the snow flat and screaming, so that you could not see your own hand at the end of your arm, could not tell up from down in it. A wind that pulled the heat out of a house faster than a stove could put it in. My uncle had got the stock into the lee of the barn, and the barn shut tight, and we were all four in the kitchen with the stove roaring and the lamps lit, and the shutters barred, safe, or as safe as a body can be when the whole country has turned to a howling white wall outside the walls, when we counted heads and Tess was not among them. I have gone back over that hour 10,000 times in my life. She had been there. She had been at the table not an hour before, drawing on a slate. And then in the bustle of barring up against the storm, we had each thought the other had her. And the truth, the terrible truth, was that earlier in the day, before the storm broke, Tess had let it slip to me, and only me. And I had not thought to tell, being 8 and a fool, that she had hidden a litter of half-wild barn kittens in the old root cellar dug into the hillside 100 yards above the house, and that she meant to bring them in where it was warm before they froze. And when we found her gone and her coat gone with her, I knew, with a sickness I can taste yet, exactly where my baby sister had gone, out into the worst storm of that winter or any winter, after a basket of kittens, 100 yards up a hillside that had become, in that wind, as far and as deadly as the moon. I told them. God forgive me how long it took me to make the words come, but I told them, and I will say this for the rest of my days. Nobody wasted a breath on blame. My uncle was already pulling on his coat, and so was Verena. "You'll not both go," my uncle said. "If we both go out in that and don't come back, these two are orphaned twice over. You stay." And Verena said, and I hear it still, "Two of us have twice the chance of finding her, and half the chance of dying. We tie a line to the porch post, and we hold the line, and we go together, and we bring your girl home. I didn't winter through to be sat in a kitchen while a child freezes. Now give me the other lantern." He looked at her 1 second. 1 second in the roar of that storm, with the lamplight on the both of them. And then he gave her the lantern. He gave her the lantern, and I understood that he had just trusted her with the thing he loved most in the world, sent her out into the killing dark beside him after his sister's child, and that there is no greater thing one frightened person can give another than that. They tied a length of rope to the porch post and the other end around the two of them together, lashed waist to waist so the storm could not take one without the other, and they went out into the white, and the white swallowed them whole, lantern light and all, in 3 steps. I will not draw out the worst hour of my life longer than I must. They found her. They found her by Verena's doing, for Verena, who knew the country's water, knew that the root cellar sat just below the little dry seep that ran under the snow, and she felt the lay of the land through her feet where my uncle, half-blind and frantic, would have gone past it, and she pulled him by the rope and the two of them dug down to the cellar door and got it open. And there was Tess, half froze and crying and clutching a basket of kittens against the front of her coat, alive. Alive because the root cellar had held the earth's small warmth. Alive because a 6-year-old stubborn love of small things had put her in the one hole in the ground that could keep her till they came. Getting her back was the harder half. The line had iced and the wind had risen, and the cold was the kind that wants to lie down, that whispers to you how good it would feel to just stop. And Verena told me, years and years later, that there was a moment on that hillside, with Tess wrapped inside both their coats between them and the porch light gone out, and the rope their only thread back to the living world, when my uncle stumbled and went down and did not get up right away, just knelt in the snow. And she thought, "This is where we die, the 3 of us." On a hillside 20 rods from a warm stove, and she got down in the snow and she put her face against his face and she said his name. She said, "Gideon, Gideon Crane, you get up. You did not bury Ada and your sister both to lie down on a hill and leave these children to me. Get up." And he got up. He got up because she made him, because somewhere in the worst hour of both their lives she had become the reason his body kept moving. And they followed that iced rope hand over hand back to the porch post and fell through the door into the warm in a heap, the 3 of them, snowblind and shaking and weeping, alive. We thawed Tess slow and careful through the rest of that night, the way Verena directed, with warm cloths and not hot, and broth a spoon at a time. And by morning the storm had blown itself out, and the sun came up on a white silent world, and my sister was sleeping ordinary sleep with a kitten she had refused to be parted from tucked under her chin. And she lived a long life, and died an old woman with grandchildren of her own, and never once in it forgot what was done for her on that hill. But here is the part that this whole long telling has been walking toward. Here is the morning after. My uncle and Verena had not slept. They had sat up the whole night between them tending Tess, and when the gray light came they were both still in the kitchen, gray-faced and hollow-eyed and worn down to the thread, and I had crept out to the top of the stairs where I could see them, And I saw my uncle reach across the table, this hard man, and take Verena's hand, her chapped, frost-bitten, ditch-digging hand, and hold it in both of his. And I saw him try to say a thing, and fail, and try again, and what finally came out of him, in a voice I had never heard, low and broke clean open, was this: "I can't do the bargain anymore." He held her hand harder. "I can't have you in the next room and call you a piece of paper. I went out in that storm last night, and the only thought in my whole head that wasn't fear was that I could not bear to lose you too. Not you. I have buried everyone I ever, and I cannot do it cold, Verena. I cannot live in the same house as you and keep on pretending I don't." And there he stuck, and could not finish. This man who had not said a tender word in years foundered on the deep water of it. And Verena, who was made of iron, who had built herself a fortress of plain speech against exactly this moment, who had said to him in September, "I am not asking you to love me, and I am not offering to love you." Verena turned her hand over in his so that they were palm to palm, and she let the iron go. I watched her let it go. I watched a thing leave her face that she had been carrying so long she'd forgotten the weight of it, and she said, "Then don't pretend. I'm tired, Gideon. I'm so tired of being a fortress." And her voice cracked. "I told you love doesn't last in this country. I believed it. I buried a husband believing it. And then you built a bracket for my bees." And she laughed, this little wet broken laugh. "You built a bracket for my bees, you fool man, and I have been undone since November and too proud to say so." He did not say anything to that. There are moments past the use of words. He just stood up, still holding her hand, and came around the table, and he put his arms around her, slow. The way you'd handle something you were afraid was breakable and had just found out was not. And she stood up into it. And the two of them held on to each other in the gray kitchen light, with the storm blown out and the children safe, and the whole impossible weight of two griefs and one terrible night between them. And neither one of them said the word, but they did not need to any more, because the word was the thing they were standing inside of. I went back to bed. Some things a boy knows not to watch. They were married again in the spring, you might say, though there was no second ceremony and no need of one. They had married for the land in September, and they married for love in February, and it was the same paper and the same two people, and the only thing that changed was everything. The paper had said 2 houses. Come the thaw, they were 1 house, and the room she had slept in alone went to me, and Tess kept her kittens, and the hollow and the benchland ran together under one name. Verena moved her bees out to a row of hives along the south fence where the sun struck them first, and they cast swarms every spring after, and the whole of the Bell Iron tasted of that wild rim country honey for 30 years. The note. I promised I'd tell you about the note, and I will, because folks always want to know how the worldly part came out, and it came out clean. There was never any villainy in it, only the slow worldly pressure of a man like Voss buying up water, and the answer to it was not a gunfight, whatever the dime novels would have you believe about this country. The answer was the spring and the work. The Ash Hollow water, run down the ditch they'd dug together that first autumn, turned the dry toe of the Bell Iron into the surest hay ground on the east side of the rim, and surest hay in a country of killing winters is worth more than gold, and the winter that nearly took us all proved it past any argument. The Bell Iron came through that February with stock standing when half the outfits on the double V side had gone to bone. Because Voss had bought a great deal of water, but he had not bought the people who knew how to use it. And Verena Ashcroft Crane knew water the way other folks know their own name. My uncle paid Mr. Pell's note in full the next autumn out of the first fat hay crop, paid it across the man's own desk in cash. And Mr. Pell, who was not a cruel man, only a careful one, shook his hand and said it was the first widow's note in his career that had come back to him paid by the widow's own water and the widow's own wits. And Verena, who was standing right there and would not be left in the wagon for a thing like that, said, "It generally does, Mr. Pell. When somebody troubles to lend the widow the money in the first place, and the banker had the grace to color up. Voss bought other water other years. He never got the Ash Hollow spring. He's 40 years dead and the spring still runs." My Uncle Gideon lived to be old, so did Verena. I have a picture of them somewhere, taken at the very end, the two of them gray as the rim in winter, sitting on the porch of the house that had once been so cold, with the green benchland falling away below and the ditch they dug catching the evening light like a thread of silver laid across the land. And they are not touching in the picture, because they were not ever much for showing it in front of a camera. But if you knew them, if you had spent a winter inside that house, you would see it in the way they are turned a little toward each other, the way two trees that have grown a long time side by side will lean, without meaning to, into the same wind. I asked her once, when I was grown and she was old and my uncle was newly in the ground, whether she had ever regretted it, riding down our lane that September day with a business proposition and a borrowed mare, trading love, which she'd said did not last, for water, which she'd said did. She was a long time answering. She was sitting in the sun with her hands quiet in her lap, those hands that had dug the ditch and doctored the cow and pulled my sister out of the frozen ground, and she watched the silver thread of the water for a while, and then she said, "I had it backward, Caleb. That's the only thing I ever truly got wrong in my life, and I built a whole fortress on it. I thought water lasted and love didn't." She smiled, and it was a young woman's smile on an old woman's face, and the rim light was in her eyes. "But I'll tell you what I learned that winter up on that hill with your sister between us and the dark all around. The water was never the thing that lasted. The water was just what made him let me in. The love was the spring." She nodded out at the country, at the green her water had made, at the place where two ranches and two griefs and one piece of paper had grown together into one long good life. The love was the thing that never once ran dry. She is buried beside him now, the both of them up on the rise above the spring, where the wild bees still work the rim flowers their swarms have seeded, and the ditch they dug with their own hands that first cold autumn still carries the cold clean water down across the benchland every spring of the world, and it will go on carrying it long after the last person who remembers them is gone. I am that person now. I am the last one left who knew that the easiest married couple in the county began as two frightened people and a piece of paper, and who knows what it cost them to become what they became, and who stood at the top of the stairs in the gray morning after the storm and watched a hard man let a hard woman pass the last of his walls, and watched her let down the last of hers, and learned at the age of 8, watching, the only thing I have ever been sure of since, that a home is not a thing you are given. It is a thing two people dig, like a ditch, in hard ground in a hard season with their own hands, neither one believing it will fill. And then one morning you stand at the edge of your life and look, and against everything you swore you knew, against every wall you ever built, the cold, clean water has come walking down to you out of the high country, and it is full.